It's great to see everybody here today. I know that we have a lot of people traveling. We also have a lot of visitors today. So if you're visiting with us, we are so glad that you're here. We consider you an honored guest, and we hope that you will stick around for a little bit after our service is over. If you are visiting, directly in front of you on the pew is a yellow visitor's card. If you would, please fill that out for us so that we can have a record of you being with us, and we really would appreciate that. This is the official kickoff of summer, Memorial Day weekend, and so I know a lot of activities are right around the corner. One of those is camp season. So we, of course, participate in 3 different weeks of camp, the first of which starts next Sunday. And I know that sort of snuck up on us, but that's going to be week 1 of Backwoods Christian Camp. And so if you are planning to go to Backwoods, I know a lot of you have already registered and such, please just shoot me a text message today. We are going to make our travel arrangements, make sure we have everything. And so if you're planning on going to Backwoods, please just kind of send me a text today and let me know for sure. And it's not too late to sign up. If you're still interested in going, whether as a camper or a counselor, still would love for you to be a part of our group that leaves next Sunday. Following that, of course, is week 1 up at Camp Watoga. I know we have a large contingent that's already planning on going up there. And then following week 2 as well, the Boardtown week, we have a group that goes and participates there. And so really excited about camp. Also in the bulletin, you have your summer series that's listed. Really excited for the start of those lessons. And so those will begin next Wednesday night. Mike Gerganis will be our first speaker. So we hope that you'll be here every Wednesday for that. Go ahead and open your Bibles, if you would, to the book of Judges. We're going to be there most of our time this morning. Couple of prayer requests to remember. One, Mila is sick today, so Carla is at home with her, and she's extra pitiful. And those of you remember what it was like when your little kids were sick. It's not a fun time for anybody, so keep both of them in your prayers. And also, John mentioned this during his prayer. The gentleman that hired me for my first preaching job in Phoenix City, a gentleman named Max Carter, passed away this past week after a fall and a long hospital stay. And so Wednesday is going to be his funeral, and I'm going to go back and help with that, and looking forward to that, just kind of seeing some folks I hadn't seen in a while. But if you would, please remember the Carter family. He was 91 years old. I was telling our Bible class this morning, he and I spent a lot of time together when I was preaching there in Phoenix City. But one of my favorite memories, when he turned 85, I took him out to dinner. We went to Outback Steakhouse, and I thought, how big of a steak can an 85-year-old man eat? And he showed me. He ate every bit of his steak and the sides, and finished off dessert with a grin too. And so I really enjoyed spending time with him. He had been a member at Broad Street since 1956. And so just a model of faithfulness. So please remember his family in prayer. We're talking about strength this morning. If you were to ask me, the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about strength, it is, as a kid, watching the strongman competitions on ESPN. This is where Brent Musburger first sort of gained his wide appeal. This was the time where you'd go and these guys would be picking up cars and lifting up all kind of stuff that didn't really need to be lifted up, but you would go and you see these guys, and they were just as big around as they were tall, and they'd go and you'd see all these feats of strength. I also remember as a kid, there was this group of people that traveled around from school to school called the Power Team. They were a ministry. I don't know if they made it up to North Georgia or not, but these guys would go and they'd perform all these incredible feats of strength and power. And we think about strength, and we think about lifting weights. You see, I've got these pictures of these weights here on the screen, and we think about that, and we think about strength and power. And this morning we're going to talk about the strongest man we ever read about in the Bible, and his name is Samson. And so what comes to your mind when you think about strength, when you think about power? Because I think sometimes what happens to us is we fall into this trap of thinking that power and strength are things that we have. That somehow if I can become physically strong enough, then that'll help the strength that I would like to have, and I can conquer anything that comes my way. But we all know that as it relates to physical strength, there's always going to be some person that's bigger and some person that's stronger. And so instead, what we want to focus on is having spiritual strength, having that strength that only comes from God. And hopefully in our time together this morning, we'll talk about how to define this true strength and how to maybe gain and harness it. But we're going to start in Judges chapter 13, and we're not going to read all 4 chapters. I just kind of want to go through this narrative with you, this Samson narrative. He is born in Judges 13, and he's born in a very interesting way. This is a motif that we see in the Old Testament, and it has to do with people who thought they couldn't have children having them. Very much as an angel visited Abraham and Sarah, or as an angel visited Mary. An angel shows up to Manoah and his wife. The angel says, "You're going to have a son." And so what they decide is that they are going to commit their son to God through what's known as the Nazirite vow. And so leave a marker there in Judges 13 and turn back to Numbers. Numbers chapter 6. Excuse me. Numbers chapter 6, starting in verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when either a man or a woman consecrates an offering to take the vow of a Nazirite to separate himself to the Lord, he shall separate himself from wine and similar drink. He shall drink neither vinegar made from wine nor vinegar made from similar drink. Neither shall he drink any grape juice nor eat fresh grapes or raisins. All the days of his separation, he shall eat nothing that is produced by the grapevine from seed to skin. In all the days of the vow of his separation, no razor shall come upon his head until the days are fulfilled for which he separated himself to the Lord. He shall be holy. Then he shall let the locks of his head grow. In all the days that he separates himself to the Lord, he shall not go near a dead body." And he goes on to give some more of these details. So if you want to focus on the Nazirite vow has 3 rules to it. Number 1, you can't have anything that is related to a grape. That's talking about alcohol or wine, or here it even says a grape or a raisin. So you have to stay away from, let's just use it as alcoholic beverages. The second part of this Nazirite vow is that you can never cut your hair. Now, I'm looking around this morning. Some of you would be all right taking this Nazirite vow in that part, but for whatever period of time was chosen, the Nazirite vow, you didn't cut your hair. And it's interesting to note, this was not a vow that was usually taken for an entire lifetime. It was usually for a period of time to separate oneself from whatever's going on in the world. But then the third thing that this vow has, and we've talked about this briefly before, is that you cannot touch or go near a dead body. So there's 3 rules you have to follow in this vow. Stay away from alcohol and grapes. Stay away from anything that would cut your hair, razor, scissors. And 3, stay away from dead bodies and unclean things. That's all that's a part of this vow. And so Manoah and his wife decide that Samson will take this Nazirite vow, and this will be something that he adheres to forever. So let's go back to our story, Judges 13. I encourage you, if you have some time this afternoon, go and read Judges 13 through 16, and you'll see this whole story and sort of fill in the gaps. And so Samson is born, and he has this vow, and he grows up, and he's given this power from God. He's separated from the world. And when we get to chapter 14, he's already an adult. And I think these first 3 verses of Judges chapter 14, if you want to highlight these, I think these illustrate Samson's biggest problems in his life. I think that this is a huge statement about Samson's big problem. Listen to what he says. "Now Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines." Now, just a little context, what's going on in Judges is that you've got God's people and they're constantly being unfaithful. This is after the time of Joshua, and the people are unfaithful, and God will bring up a judge and they'll be faithful for a while, and then they'll start worshiping false gods again. And so God will deliver them into the hands of an enemy. And you have this cycle that goes on. And what's going on here is that the Philistines, you remember these people? They had a little size on them. They had very famous Philistine. You remember his name? You can say it. Goliath, right? And so these have been enemies of God from this time, and they'll continue to be enemies into the time where David defeats Goliath. And so they'll be, they're enemies. And here the Philistines are ruling over the Israelites. And so Samson goes to their enemies, to the people who are against God, and he's going to find a wife. Verse 2, he went up and he told his father and mother, saying, I've seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now, therefore, get her for me as a wife. And his father and mother said to him, is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren or among all my people that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she pleases me well. Or better said this way, go and get her for me because she is what I want. And so this to me is very telling of Samson's biggest problem, is that he wants what he wants regardless of what God's opinion about it is. And as we go through this talk this morning, we're going to be thinking about Samson, and we're going to say, oh, how could he make those decisions, and how could he live that way, and how could he do those things? And we're going to look at Samson, and we're going to say, Samson is a perfect, example of what Israel was doing. Israel and Samson were both unfaithful to God, and we can look at it in that big picture, and theologically that's a significant part of this. But what I want us to understand this morning is, as Christians living in 2019, we are very much like Samson, in that whatever we want, we go after. Regardless of the consequences, regardless of whether we know it's wrong, if we have desires, we seek to fulfill them. And that's what's going on here with Samson. And so he chooses this Philistine wife. And so as he's going down, he's going to have a bachelor party. They're going to have a big drinking party, a feast. Now, why is that interesting that Samson's going to go to a big drinking party? Because if he's taken this Nazirite vow, he can't touch the stuff, right? But he's going to this party, and along the way, here comes a lion. A lion comes along, and it says that Samson, with his bare hands, in the same way that you would tear a young goat, he kills the lion. Now, some of you may have torn young goats before. Maybe that's just what they did for fun back then. I don't know, but it sounds like tearing a young goat in half would probably be hard too. But apparently it was easy for Samson. And so Samson destroys and kills this lion. And later on, as he's coming back, this lion is there, and he finds a beehive and some honey in there. And so he reaches in and he grabs the honey. Now, what's the problem with this? The second part of that vow that he's already violated is that you can't touch a dead body. And so he goes to this party and he poses a riddle to these 30 guys. And he says, guys, if you can figure out the riddle, then, I'll buy every one of you a new set of clothes. He said, but if you can't figure out the riddle, then every one of you is going to have to buy me a suit of clothes. And so these people, they go in, and Samson's Philistine wife, they convince her to go and find out the answer to the riddle. And so at first he doesn't tell her, and 3 days go by, and she doesn't know the answer. And finally, after pleading with him for 7 days, he breaks down and tells her the answer to the riddle. Now, we're going to criticize Samson a lot this morning. But if your wife has been nagging you with the same question, asking you the same question for 7 days, there's not a man in here that wouldn't tell her the answer. We're just being honest about that point, right? And so they find out the answer, and one of the greatest lines in here is at the end of chapter 14, in verse 18. So the men of the city, Judges 14:18, said to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, what is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? And he said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. Men, let me give you a piece of advice. Do not in your wildest dreams ever call your wife a heifer. Remember, this is a different culture, right? But basically what he's saying to them is, if you wouldn't have put my wife up to it, you never would have figured it out. And so he does go and get 30 sets of clothes. But what he does is he kills 30 men and takes their clothes and takes them back to those men and says, here's your sets of clothing that you wanted so bad that you had to lie and deceive to get it. And so this party, of course, is no fun. This feast is over, and Samson goes back to his father's house. And a little while later, at the beginning of chapter 15, he comes back and he's going to go back into his wife. But there's a problem. Judges chapter 15, verse 1. After a while, in the time of the wheat harvest, it happened that Samson visited his wife with a young goat. And he said, let me go into my wife, into her room. And we know what that would have been about. But the father would not permit him to go in. Her father said, I really thought that you thoroughly hated her. Therefore, I gave her to your companion. So here's an issue. That word there, companion, would probably have meant the best man at his wedding, in our understanding of it. The head guy that was right there planning the big party and planning the feast for Samson. Samson leaves, and so the father says, well, I guess he's not coming back. And so his wife becomes the wife of this man. And the next part is even better. Listen to what he says. Is not her younger sister better than she? Please take her instead. He says, hey, you can't have her, but she's got a younger sister. She's better looking anyway, so you can just marry her and everything will be forgiven. Samson says, that's not the answer I was looking for. So he does this thing that I still really can't understand or comprehend, but he goes and he gathers up a bunch of foxes. And he ties them tail to tail and puts a torch in the middle. Now, I've never played with foxes, but I know what would happen if you did that to cats. You could create a mess real fast, right? And so they go and they destroy all the crops and the vineyards of the Philistines. They set them on fire and burn them down. And that story, which was kind of funny, takes a really sad turn because of that. The Philistines, since Samson had caused that damage, they go and they kill his former wife and her father as punishment for Samson's actions. And then they go to Judah, and now remember, they're in control of Israel. And they say, Samson destroyed our crops, so we want him as a prisoner. And so 3,000 Israelites, men of Judah, they go up to Samson. Now, you talk about having a reputation for being able to fight. Not 3 guys show up to take Samson, 3,000. And so he says, that's okay. He said, just tie me up and take me over, and you can give me to the Philistines. And so they arrest him and they take him and they get there. And then the verse that Lewis read for us, he takes the jawbone of a donkey. Now you've got to think, a donkey has a pretty long jaw, so this would have been a good size weapon. But it says, verse 15 of Judges 15, he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it. By the way, he's not supposed to be touching anything dead or unclean, remember? And he took it and killed 1,000 men with it. And then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I've slain 1,000 men. That rhymes in Hebrew, by the way. And so he kills 1,000 men with one weapon. This is in addition to the other 30 men he's already killed, right? And so we see this power that Samson has, but here he slays all these people as a consequence. And then in verse 20, it says, and he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. So he has a long tenure as a judge. But then after we see that he's faithful to God, look at the first verse of Judges 16. Now Samson went to Gaza, which is the capital of the Philistine Empire, and he saw a harlot there, a prostitute, and he went in to her. So he's going and being in a place he should not be, and so they figure they're going to trap him. And so they wait for him outside the gates, and he comes and they tie him to the city gates. This would have been the big gates. We don't know what they would have been made of. I think about iron. They tie him to these big iron gates that guard their capital city. And so what does he do? He picks the gates up out of the ground and carries them up the hill as he walks out of town. That's got to be a sight, right? You think you've got this guy as prisoner and you tie him up to the gates, and he picks the gates up out of the ground and carries them away, leaving your city exposed. And so once again, God has delivered Samson out of a bad situation. And then in verse 4, afterward it happened that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. Some people have said that name means something to do with night. And so her name foreshadows Samson's downfall. And they go through this number of activities. And you know, Samson knows that he shouldn't trust this woman. That's why he gives her several fake answers before he gives her the real answers. But finally, as he finally violates the third part of this Nazirite vow, Delilah cuts his hair. And Samson is taken prisoner by the Philistines. And the text is pretty graphic here. It says they gouge out his eyes. What they probably would have done would be something more like they would heat up a stick or a metal rod and stab it in his eye. And then they would take something like a spoon and just kind of scoop out whatever was left after the fire. And they completely blind Samson. They take him as prisoner. And so he's held there in prison, supposedly God's chosen judge, and it's a very defeated feeling for Samson and for the Israelites. But then in verse 23, now the lords of the Philistines, this is Judges 16:23, gathered together to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god and to rejoice. And they go and they sing this song, right? And then in verse 25, and so it happened when their hearts were merry, they said, call for Samson that he may perform for us. And so they go through this thing and they tie Samson to these two pillars. And Samson asks God, God, will you give me one more period of strength? And so there's 3,000 of the wealthiest and most important Philistines there. And he pulls this building down on top of himself and on top of those 3,000 people. And it says that day he killed more people than he had any other time in his life combined. And so Samson dies while taking out and destroying 3,000 of God's enemies. I mean, this is an intense, complicated story of a very strong man with a lot of weaknesses. And I put these up here. These to me are three of the fatal flaws of Samson. And we're just going to go through them very briefly. The first one is that Samson is extremely impulsive. Now, sometimes being impulsive and being spontaneous can be a good thing, right? If you want to go and you just impulsively make a decision and you create a good memory, and that's wonderful. But you cannot live your life constantly bending and yielding to every impulse that you have. He was impulsive. He had a temper. He made decisions just based on how he felt, and it cost him everything in the end. And you and I fall into this trap of being impulsive too and losing our temper. The second thing, he was incredibly compromising. He had these rules that he was supposed to follow, and yet when it was convenient, he said, well, I kind of know I'm supposed to live, but I want to compromise and do what makes me happy instead. And then thirdly, and man, this is so important, is he had a ton of pride. Leave a marker there and turn with me to 1 John chapter 2. We had a discussion about this in our Bible class this morning, and I think it fits really well here. 1 John 2, starting in verse 15. This is a passage that you're very familiar with. It says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away and the lust of it, but he who does the will of God abides forever." Man, isn't this a comparison of that verse? Couldn't you say that if I'm impulsive, I'm just constantly intrigued by the lust of the flesh? That anything I want, when I see it, I go for it, and I yield to my impulses, and I make that decision. That's the lust of the flesh. Compromising, the lust of the eyes. Yeah, I know it's wrong, but I want that really bad, and so I'm going to compromise my beliefs so that I can get it. And then the pride of life. When the Bible tells us over and over that God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble, because of our pride and our ego and who we are and how we want to be known and how we want our name to live on forever, we're willing to do anything because of that pride. And for Samson, that pride ended up being his downfall. We could identify a lot of other flaws, but he was impulsive, he was compromising, and he was proud. Things that unfortunately all of us deal with all three of these as well. These flaws. Then finally this morning, here's the biggest problem, is that Samson was unfaithful. Samson was unfaithful. I want you to stay there in your New Testament and turn over to 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2. Starting in verse 11. And we remember the context of 1 Peter. Remember, these people are scattered all over the place, and they're Christians living in an unchristian pagan society. And Peter says to them, "Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims," or strangers and aliens, some version says, or exiles, as some versions might say, "to abstain from those fleshly lusts which war against the soul." He says all these things that are going to be constantly going on within you, this battle that's going to rage, whether you say, I want to walk by the flesh or walk by the Spirit. I heard a preacher say the other day, and he's so right, you cannot be both controlled by your desires and led by the Spirit. Those things are incompatible. They do not work. You can't say, I'm going to separate myself from the world. I'm going to be different. I'm going to live my life for God. But whenever I desire something, I'm going to compromise that so that I can go and get it. Yeah, I'm going to walk with God, but I'm also going to do whatever I want. Those two things do not go together. At some point in our life, we have to sacrifice the things we want to be faithful to the God that we want to serve. And we've got to learn to sacrifice those things. And Samson couldn't do it. Samson could not wage war against those fleshly lusts. They conquered him. And so I put in 3 different ways here that he was unfaithful. And I'm going to tell you, these are going to touch a nerve with us because we're guilty of all of these. Number 1, Samson could not keep his word. He made this Nazirite vow. He said, I'm going to stay away from alcohol. And yet the first thing that we see is Samson, when it's time to get married to a woman he had no business marrying anyway, he goes and he's going to have this great feast where everybody gets drunk and celebrates. The second part of that was you've got to stay away from dead bodies. In that same story, literally the same day, he goes and he takes some honey from the carcass of a dead animal. Now look, I like honey as much as the next person. But to go and take it out of a dead carcass with bees all around it and just hold it on your hand and eat it. And not only that, but he shared it with his parents as well so that they were involved in that same sin. And then, of course, in the next couple of chapters, we see that he loses his strength by cutting his hair. So he violates all 3 of these things. Can you imagine living your life with only 3 rules? All you've got to do is not do A, B, and C. But since the beginning of time, whenever someone has told us, you can't do this, what do we immediately go and do? we do it, right? Adam and Eve, there's one tree in this beautiful, lush garden that's full of fruit and full of anything you could ever imagine wanting. There's one place that you have to stay away from. What's the one place that he goes? Or Eve first and then Adam. Try it with your kids. Say, kids, you can have anything in this kitchen that you want. But those zebra cakes, you don't touch them. Those are not for you to eat. I guarantee you'll have an empty zebra cake box the next morning, right? Because there's something about us as human beings when we know that we're not supposed to have something, we are controlled by our impulses and we go and do that. And so this is a vow to God. And Samson says, I can't keep my word. There's a lack of integrity that dominates his life. And in our Christian walk, and we've said some funny things, but here's the serious part. In our Christian walk, our integrity as it relates to God is very, very loose. And sometimes we let the desires of the flesh overcome our integrity in our relationship with God. We're willing to compromise that for the things that we want. Because we say, just like Samson did to his father, that pleases my eyes and I want it. Samson could not keep his word. Secondly, and this one's going to ruffle a few feathers, Samson chose his partners without considering God. Not one time with a Philistine woman who, because of Samson's decision-making, ended up losing her life. Let's don't forget that. Not twice, remember the second time where he went in with a Philistine prostitute, but 3 times. Remember the third time where he went in with a woman whose very name foreshadowed his downfall. I'm not going to stand here this morning and tell you that you're wrong if you ever date a person who's not a Christian. I started dating a person who was not a Christian, and now she's the best wife I could ever imagine and best mother to my child I could ever want. So I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to stand up here and say this morning that you're in sin if you marry a non-Christian. What I am going to say, though, is it is a terrible decision to commit yourself to somebody who doesn't share the same goal that you do, and that's the goal of going to heaven. So you guys are going to be choosing partners in the next few years. Don't choose a partner without considering how it affects your relationship to God. Some of you adults might be single in that same situation. When you choose who you're going to spend your life with, realize that the first consideration is not how pretty they are. One day you won't care about that big mole on their face anymore, I promise you. It's not what their hobbies are. It's not what personality flaws that you like or don't like in each other. It's whether or not your partner has the same desire as you as it relates to how to grow closer to God and how to spend your life serving Him. Samson's unfaithfulness is largely wrapped up just in the fact that he couldn't say no to a pretty face. And listen to me now. In the end, this cost him everything. Isn't it ironic that he couldn't say no to a beautiful face, but at the end it ended up being his eyes that were gouged out, where he wasn't ever able to look upon anyone again. So I hope that we won't let this cost us everything as well. He chose a partner without considering God. And then finally, he forgot the source of his power. Do you remember when Paul said when he was writing to the Corinthians that he didn't worry about power because his strength was made perfect in his weakness by God? He forgot the source of his power. And so where does our spiritual power lie? It's right here in Romans chapter 1, verse 16. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes. The power of the message of salvation is not found in our preaching. It's not found in our ability to speak. It's not found in our ability to talk to somebody. It's not in our intelligence. It's not wrapped up in anything human. It's wrapped up in God. That's where our power comes from. As we close this morning, though, I want to consider one thing with you. Samson is a cautionary tale. He is somebody who had been given everything. He's somebody who had a tremendous gift from God, who had power, who had a great spiritual upbringing, who had a prominent position as a judge of Israel, and he had the ability to make an impact for God. Yet through his bad decision making and through his unfaithfulness, he failed in that. And there are a lot of things that I can tell you and I can share with you about God, but here's one that I really know, is that God is a God of redemption. And so when Samson, in his last moment, asked God for one more moment of power, God granted it to him, and he died conquering the enemies of God's people. And so you and I are here this morning, and we've been Christians for a long time maybe, or maybe for a short while, but I guarantee you, we've been impulsive. We've compromised our beliefs. We've let our pride get in the way of following and serving God. I guarantee you we've made bad decisions as it relates to choosing partners, or maybe not a significant other, but at least in our relationship. That we've had trouble keeping our word, that we've lost our integrity from time to time. And I guarantee you we have forgotten where the power and strength that we have as Christians comes from. But also know this, that God has the power and the desire to redeem us today. And if you're not a Christian, God has set a plan to redeem you as well. And if you want to give him your life, or if you want to make something right today, we've set this time aside as an invitation. If you want to taste of the redemption and of the power of God this morning, you can do so as we stand and as we sing this song. Calling today, calling today, high from the sunshine above wilt thou roll, farther and farther away. Calling today, calling today, Jesus is calling, is tenderly calling today. Jesus is calling the weary to rest, calling today, calling today. Bring him thy burden and thou shalt be blessed. He will not turn thee away. Calling today, calling today. Jesus is calling, is tenderly calling today. Jesus is pleading, oh, listen to his voice.